Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 79th edition of In Conversation Live. Especially interesting evening this evening with Lord Adonis, but we have one particular challenge in that Baron Andrew Adonis hasn't actually managed to log on yet. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that he will. And I've got to try and fill the gap in the hope that he will loom up on Zoom any minute. So we were going to be talking, and we will be talking if Andrew manages to get through, about his amazing career. He started off in a foster home, managed to get a scholarship to school, got a scholarship to Keble College, Oxford, got a first there, and then his amazing political career, ending up in the House of Lords. We would be talking through that, plus his passion about rejoining the European Union, about transport and HS2, which he was largely involved in the planning for, and so many other things. So any minute, I'm hoping that Andrew will appear. We've had all sorts of interesting email conversations with him, and he did promise that he would be here. This will be the first In Conversation Live when we didn't have somebody to interview. So there's always a first for everything. But whilst we're waiting, I think we'll wait just a few more minutes to see whether we can get through to him. Of course, this happens on Newsnight and on the Today programme. So I'm not that ashamed that we haven't been able to contact our guest tonight. There's loads of things going on at the RSM. We have, of course, been challenged by COVID. Our building has been closed. I've got a feeling this is Andrew looming up now. Yes, it is. That is good. I can tell you about all the special things. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
Roger, greetings.
You stressed us out ever so slightly, Andrew, but we're cool as cucumbers here.
Well, I told you I'd be here, and I'm here.
Yeah, good for you. Good for you. Andrew, I think I told you. Yep. We can see you beautifully in your office there. You look very smart in your white shirt and your suit.
Yes, so do you. You have much better art than mine.
Thank you. Andrew, I think I said to you in one of our communications, this program is a bit like Desert Island Disc, but with no music. And it always starts off Desert Island Disc with a sort of, your family background. And you have an especially interesting family background. Talk us through that. Your dad from Cyprus and your mum who buggered off, if you pardon the expression, when you were 3, et cetera, et cetera. Tell us the story.
Well, it goes back a bit further than that,
right.
Actually, the story of me, because my dad's an immigrant. Part of the reason why I'm so passionate on Britain being in Europe and staying in the European Union is that I'm part English and part Cypriot. Mm-hmm. And there are 2 elements to this that are really important. The first is, of course, I have a huge identity with people who come and make their life here, who come from abroad, and I think it's a good thing, and we're enriched by it and all of that. So that's important. But there's another element which is hugely important to understand the Cypriot thing, which is Cyprus is still a divided country. Nicosia is the only capital in Europe that's still divided. It's like Berlin before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, literally with UN blue helmets and all that keeping the peace. Now, and this is because of the invasion of one European country by another in our lifetimes, and it still hasn't been either reversed, nor is there a peace settlement, nor is there a power sharing. And this would be rather like Northern Ireland, but without the Good Friday Agreement. And this is all in Europe. And so what we want, in my view, is a more and stronger Europe with more and stronger European values, and with Britain thoroughly engaged. So that's the prior bit. My dad, and why did my dad come here in 1959? Because then they both Greek and Turkish Cypriots, so both of the communities which are now at loggerheads in Cyprus, both of them, of course, were then engaged in a war of independence against, guess who? Britain, because Britain was the colonial power until Cyprus became independent in 1963. And it was, we don't talk about it now because people want bygones to be bygones, and a lot of Cypriots came to Britain, and Britain's a great friend of the Republic of Cyprus, which is the Greek part of Cyprus. But it was a classic independence movement, including what was effectively a guerrilla war, effectively mass internments, effectively concentration camps, and all of that. And that's with the third European power, Britain. So I think it's very important that we all start getting on together and we don't repeat all of these atrocities and horrific cases of the past. But the reason my dad came here in 1959 was to escape from the War of Independence, because he was then 18, coming on 19, and whole villages were being interned. It was extremely dangerous. I mean, lots of people were being killed. And the parents, so far as possible, wanted to get their kids out. And the only place they knew where to get them out was England, because they had English passports. It's slightly ironic. They were engaged in a war of independence against Britain. And as they got out, all of the family members they could, particularly the young, they sent them all to Britain. So my dad arrived on a train via Venice and Paris with nothing other than the train tickets and the address of his older brother, who he then worked for in a cafe and all of that. And that's why he came here. So it was ironically to escape from what was essentially a war situation in Cyprus then with another European power, and now, of course, the place where he lives. And so he arrived here at 18, and like a lot of 17, 18-year-olds, completely transplanted from their backgrounds and all of that. He found it quite hard to make his way, fell in with the first girl he met and so on. So ended up with two kids very young, in his early 20s. And the marriage broke up and he couldn't cope. And I ended up in a children's home where I spent the best part of the next 10 years. So it was a very unusual background, but it did give me quite a sort of good view of the challenges of life. And when people say it must be terrible having that background and living in a children's home and so on. Actually, I don't think so. I think most of what I've achieved in life has basically come from my childhood and the sense of drive, ambition, and being able to, cope and all that, and not taking anything for granted, knowing you had to work for everything. So I'm very grateful for what happened. And my family background and my background in terms of my European and international connections has also played an extremely important part in my life and still does. So it's an unusual background. It's probably quite important if your special subject is understanding Andrew Adonis, but I think there are some elements to it which are common to probably large numbers of people watching this conversation.
And then to go from a children's home to get into Oxford, Keble College and so on, you read history there, I think, didn't you?
Yeah.
And I think you got a first there at the end of that. So, I mean, that was a massive achievement. And when did you first think that kind of politics was where you were going? Because you started off as a journalist in the FT and the Observer, if I'm right. Well, if Wikipedia is right, where I get my information. So tell us a little bit about your, why you chose that particular route. You could have done so many different things, but journalism and then politics. I mean, you're a writer as well too, obviously.
Well, it's slightly odd knowing where our life ambitions come from in terms of things we want to do. It'd be an interesting question to ask you, Roger. When did you absolutely decide you wanted to do medicine?
Pretty young, actually. I always I wanted to be a doctor from the age of about, 14, 15. I've loved being a doctor, and I love the RSM right now. But anyway, it's about you, not me.
Well, you've answered my question, because that's exactly the age I decided I wanted to be a politician.
Right.
I was always really interested from as young as I was sort of really engaged in what was going on outside at all, in public affairs and what was happening to the country and all that. And I was a debater at school, and I used to read. I was a kind of, all those of us who get into these sorts of careers become very nerdy quite young. I used to read the Times from cover to cover every day from the age of 14. Yeah. Remember it vividly. I was born in 1963, and this was 1977-8, when the country was in a bad way, and the winter of discontent of 78-9. I thought the country was about to collapse completely, and it was all terrible and all that. I got very sort of personally engaged in all this. I used to write letters to the papers. I did all kinds of things. I was involved in campaigns to stop my local railway line being closed. I was very active in the community and all that from very young, and I wanted to to be an MP from that age. And in fact, actually, for me, and a bit like, actually, ironically, Boris Johnson, journalism was politics by other means. I was never particularly interested in journalism. I'm not, though I hold journalists in high esteem. I think that a free press is hugely important in a free society. I never saw my role as being, as it were, the guardian of the independence of the press. I saw what I wanted to do with my life as propagating serious political causes, roughly in what we would now think of as the centre-left, social democracy, or that. I became a member of the SDP, which was a social democratic breakaway from the Labour Party on my 18th birthday, which is when it was founded. And because I couldn't get into politics, I became a local councillor in Oxford when I was 22, so I started all these things young. But because it wasn't possible to become an MP then, I mean, the Liberals then only had a handful of seats and I wasn't going to get one of them. I had to do something else, which was essentially politics by other means. And for me, that was journalism. Actually, it was academe for a period. I was a university lecturer until my late 20s, but then I did journalism. But as soon as I could get seriously into politics, which I did by working for Tony Blair, and I developed a connection with him when I was at the FT, which was the great break I had really into politics. I did it. So if you're tracing it back, though there's been a kind of zigzag in terms of getting there, and there often is in careers, particularly those where there's a limited supply of posts, and therefore you're having to go through a kind of funnel. If I'd been able to say what it is I'd hoped I would have achieved by the age of 50, at the age of 14, it would have been roughly what actually happened to me, including the particular causes I took up in politics. So the two causes which have always been close to my heart from my mid-teens are education itself. I'm passionate about education reform and social mobility, and transport. I was a train spotter. And the job I wanted to do when I was aged 14 was to become chairman of British Rail, which I thought would be, then I'd have the national train set. Well, by the time I got into my 40s, British Rail had been abolished, but I did end up a Secretary of State for Transport, so I sort of did it.
I was going to ask you about the political influences you had, and I know you wrote a book about Roy Jenkins, or Roy Jenkins. I met Roy a couple of times when he had a minor medical problem that I was involved in sorting out, that we won't go into. And then Ernest Bevin, not Bevan, but Bevin, that I just actually spent the afternoon reading your book about him on my iPad. And then you've already mentioned it, Tony Blair. I think Tony Blair is one of your heroes. I think he's brilliant too.
Well, I worked for him for 10 years.
But of those three, I mean, just say a few words about all those three, because our audience won't know much about the two from the past, probably.
Well, Roy Jenkins is one of the most significant people in politics since the war who didn't become Prime Minister, and actually he's more significant than some of the people who did become Prime Minister in terms of his legacy. He was the most radically reforming Liberal Home Secretary this country has ever had. He legalised abortion, he legalised homosexuality, he ended censorship, he was a big prison reformer. He was the only genuinely successfully Liberal Home Secretary that we've had in recent times, and he believed it all passionately. He was also a great historian as well, and this combination of being a historian and being a politician always appealed to me. And when I was 14, back when these years were being formed, the first political biography I read was Roy's Life of Asquith. Asquith was a Liberal Prime Minister at the beginning of the 20th century, who began essentially with Lloyd George, began the welfare state. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I thought the book was brilliant. It gave me a passionate interest in history. It's part of the reason why I then went on to study history at university. But I also decided I wanted to be Roy Jenkins. Be a literature, I wanted to be him. I wanted to have this combination of being an actual historian, writing books about great historical things and figures, whilst also being a politician. And I have sort of done that. So that's been my sort of thing. And
you actually pronounce your R's rather similar.
I don't know whether I caught it from him. It's called a name, but and actually, Roy became a great friend of mine in later life. I was his biographer, and I did write a short biography of him. I never wrote the long one for complicated reasons, but we became great friends, and right through till his death, which was 19 years ago. So that's Roy. Ernie Bevin is, I wrote a biography of last year because he's an enormously important figure in post-war history, much more important than people realise. They often confuse him with Bevan, Yeah. Bevan is the guy who's got more of a reputation now because he invented the NHS. So Roger, your views on him, and I think by and large we think it's a positive thing. I mean, one of the greatest institutions which this country has ever created probably is the National Health Service, and Bevan was the guy who did it, so he absolutely deserves the kudos for that. Bevin, one letter different, was the Foreign Secretary in that Attlee government. Bevan was the Health Secretary. And actually, in terms, though people will be less aware of it, his legacy, both to the country and to the world, actually, was absolutely phenomenal, because he was the Foreign Secretary who did three things. He stood up to Stalin after the war and prevented Stalin from essentially colonizing Western Europe, which could easily have happened after 1945, because Russia was the dominant European power and a hugely expansionist power. And Bevin, by rallying the Americans, getting the Americans to keep their troops in Europe, which they weren't intending to do originally, persuading America to do the Berlin blockade so that Stalin's attempt essentially to take over Germany failed. All of that hugely important. The second big thing he did was to establish NATO, and NATO has been transformational in terms of the security of Europe, and that grew out of his success in keeping the Americans in Europe after the war. But the third thing he did, which is hugely important, is he was essentially the political leader who created the Federal Republic of Germany. After 1945, the original plan was to keep Germany divided and essentially treated as a colony after the Hitler period. And it's Bevin who realizes that a free and democratic Western Germany is both the right thing to do, because you're not going to be able to run this as a colony indefinitely, but also in terms of preventing a Russian takeover of Europe and instilling democratic values. It was the indispensable thing. And he persuaded the Americans to put, because Germany had been divided into 4 zones after the war, he persuaded the Americans to put their zone, which was the southwestern part of Germany, what we now think of as Bavaria, what's now Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, in with the British zone, which was the Ruhr, Rhineland, all of that, the really important, productive, industrial part of Germany. And that created the state of West Germany. And but for Ernie Bevin, I don't think it would have happened. So he's a hugely important figure, but he's become somewhat neglected, and he never had a proper biography. Yeah. And that's the book I published last year called Ernest Bevin, Labour's Churchill. And I think he's also a model for us in another sense. And he was a great trade unionist. He founded the biggest trade union, the biggest free trade union anywhere in the 20th century, and the Transport and General Workers Union. And that was hugely important to raising working conditions and all of that. It was also very important during the war, because he became Churchill's Minister of Labour during the war, and he basically rallied the home front while Churchill was doing the grand strategy, the grand military strategy. So that's all important too. And then thirdly, Tony Blair, well, I think probably you and everyone on the call know about him, so I don't need to say so much.
Well, actually, that's a good lead into what I wanted to talk about next, which is you and Tony and education. The name of your book. I think Tony came up with that, didn't he? He used it in a Labour Party conference, if I remember. But I mean, you two are the architects of the academies, which I suppose have led on to the free schools that we have now. In a way, kind of surprisingly supported by the Conservatives. Michael Gove, I know, was influential in this. Just talk us through, because I think we really need to focus on where education is, where it's going now, and the reforms that you and Tony and the Labour Party instituted, I think have been hugely beneficial. That's my view, but I'd like to hear your view. Tell us the story about how that came about, because before that we had grammar schools, public schools, and comprehensives, didn't we? And a lot of people would say that many comprehensives weren't working, I suppose. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, there were 2 big aims of the Labour, well, 3 big aims, I suppose, of the Labour government in education, all of which I think have stood the test of time. And we need to get back to them, to be frank. The first was to significantly raise public spending on education. Our view was that we were, as a country, investing too little in education. And we had historically underinvested, both in capital, a lot of post-war state school buildings are falling down and all that, but also in what we paid teachers. 20 years ago, it's hard to recruit teachers to many state schools. The supply was so poor and wages were so bad and working conditions were terrible and all that. Well, we doubled real-term spending on education in the course of that Labour government, doubled it. And I think that's a great achievement. And to understand the achievement, you need to look and see what's happened since 2010, since Labour left office. where real term spending on education in that 11 years hasn't increased at all. It's decreased significantly on capital, it's increased a little bit on revenue, but the net effect is zero. So 10 years of a Labour government, and it doubled, 10 years of a government that isn't committed to education, and it hasn't increased. Meanwhile, spending on private schools and all that has gone through the roof. This is in state schools. I'll come to universities in a moment. That was thing one. I think that was right, and we should have carried on doing it. Thing two is that about a third of the comprehensive schools, which had been set up in the 50s and 60s as secondary education, was extended across society. Before then, there hadn't been universal and compulsory secondary education. Only Bevan left school at 11, and as late as the 1940s, a large proportion of the cohort of 13 and 14-year-olds were leaving schools and not staying on till 16 at all. As the school leaving age was raised progressively by the 1970s to 16, schools were set up, but too many of them, particularly those serving poorer and working class communities, provided a really terrible standard of education. I mean, really grim. They were basically warehouses for working class kids. Most of the kids there didn't do public examinations at all. I mean, it's hard to recreate because people listening to this just won't be familiar unless they had parents who went through it. They didn't do public examinations, very limited curriculum, poor facilities, massive truancy and disaffection by the age of 15, 16, and kids who are basically time serving to get to 16, then they go off into manual jobs. But of course, the big problem was by the 80s and 90s, a lot of the manual jobs, the mining industry, the shipbuilding and all of that, they were all declining. So our view was that we needed to systematically reinvent comprehensive school to be a high quality, not a low quality institution, to get the kids up to a decent standard, see they did sit exams, they had the same opportunities as those who were going to grammar schools and private schools. And that was the fundamental guiding principle of the academies programme, was that every community, however poor, was going to have an outstanding secondary school, really good school buildings. The academies were largely new and so on, and special incentives to get teachers there, sixth forms in the schools. Most of these comprehensive didn't have sixth forms, so it was very difficult to stay on beyond the age of 16 and all that. Well, that I think was, again, a success. It's slowed down since 2010 too, but fortunately hasn't been reversed. Big policy number three was to expand higher education. My great break in life, and probably yours, Roger, actually, was getting to a decent university. That's once you've got to a decent university in this society of ours, you can do anything. Those who don't get to a decent university, either because they decide not to do it or because they don't get the qualifications to get them there, they have a pretty grim time in terms of forging careers. Not universally so. Sometimes they strike it lucky, sometimes they're in well-paid manual jobs, but there aren't that many of those left now. And my view is on the principle of R.H. Tawney, the great socialist philosopher, what the wise parent would wish for their child, so the state should wish for all children. If I want higher education for my kids, both of my kids have gone to university. I don't know if you've got kids, Roger, but I imagine yours have, if they have, and so on. If that's what we want for ours, that's what we should want for all those, at least to have the opportunity to do it, but a steadily higher proportion to do it, which is why we set the 50% target, which is controversial, but I stand by it completely correct in my view, in terms of social progress and a better trained and qualified society and all that, for 50% of the cohort to go into university, whereas when I was at university in the early 1980s, only 1 in 10 of 18-year-olds went to uni. Now it's more than half. But in order to pay for that, we had to have a student finance reform, and that was very controversial and difficult because it meant students having to pay more, but they paid for it under the student fees rate reform we brought about after they graduated. So it's essentially a graduate tax. And the punt that we took at the time, which was a bit of a punt because we didn't have a huge evidence base to go on, is that once teenagers who are, generally bright and understand their interests, understood that they weren't, and their families weren't having to cough up front, they were getting it all for free in terms of the higher education, the degrees and all of that, but they would pay back through the tax system a proportion of their earnings to pay off the debt that they'd taken on. This wouldn't dissuade them from going to uni. On the contrary, they would carry on going in large numbers. And that has proved to be the case. Even though the tuition fees reform was controversial, there were big demos and all of that, which often happens when you try to do things that students don't like. In fact, it's gone hand in hand with a big expansion of universities, much better funding of universities, university lecturers and all that are better paid, which was important, but also a big expansion in student numbers, including kids from working class backgrounds whose parents didn't go. So as I look back on the the Labour government and education, I think it did live up to the Tony Blair mantra: education, education, education. And I think we should be getting back to it.
Well, I would agree with that. A couple of other things about education. I mean, I think maybe it was you that said, I certainly read somewhere that one of the problems with the best free schools or academies is that although they're free and access should be to everybody, in fact, what happens is all the middle class people move in around them and buy expensive houses, so that the localities are surrounded by high value houses, so they're not actually available. And that kind of leads me on to your issues about class and the fact that the British society is in a way still class ridden. We haven't got rid of the middle classes, the divide between the middle classes and the working classes. So thoughts about those aspects?
Well, of course it's true. I mean, it's a truism. It's the obvious statement that if you have good schools and there's an undersupply of good schools, then people are going to flock to them. Obviously, that's true.
Yeah.
What's the answer? To have more good schools. And that's exactly what the Academy's programme was about. If you've got enough good schools, then people don't need to move house in order to get to good school. They have one anyway. And actually, people move house less now. They still do to some extent. And some people still, of course, still choose to send their children to private schools. Though now, increasingly, in my experience, they're doing that for social reasons, not for educational reasons. Mm-hmm. But because there's a lot more good schools now, there's a lot less of a social angst that means people are actually moving and making some really serious, decisions about where they locate themselves, what jobs they're going to take, and all that, simply to be near to schools. Now, we need still more good schools. There are still too many communities, particularly in what we now call the Red Wall in the Midlands and the North, where the schools didn't improve as much as they did in London and the South, the state schools. So we need more of them, but there are a lot more than there were. There's a lot less people flocking to honeypots of good schools because they haven't got any around them. And as I see it, it's work in progress and we should carry on doing it, creating more of them. And that's the answer to this problem. In terms of the underlying social and class issues, I mean, they're obviously still with us. But I think that for those who get into the education system and make a success of it, this is their way out of being stuck.
Yeah.
In class and income terms. The problem is that we still have, we said it's a great triumph having half going to university, and it is, but that still leaves half who didn't go to university. And that, I think, is the big blight zone of the education system still today. What happens to those who don't go to uni? Apprenticeships are hit and miss. There aren't the same career opportunities. There aren't the same routes into careers. Wages are lower. Employment is much more uncertain, and that, I think, is a huge and continuing social issue. And if I became Minister of Education again, my big priority, as it were, second time round now, would be on apprenticeships and career pathways for kids who don't get the opportunity or don't have the aptitude to go on to uni. We haven't done enough to reform that, and I think we need a German-style apprenticeship system in Britain, and it's high time somebody started creating one.
Actually, there's a question coming from Mark Upton that sort of fits into this part of the conversation. He says, we've got a shortage of tradesmen in Britain and joiners, bricklayers, toolmakers, etc. As evidenced by your earlier statement, if you don't get to university, you have a horrid time of it. Did Labour miss a trick and overlook the importance of education in practical skills?
Well, it didn't do enough. That's certainly true. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But it was alive to it, and there were quite a number of programmes, welfare to work, other programmes to get people into jobs. We spent a lot more on further education. It's FE colleges that kids who don't go on to uni by and large go to, and so on. What we didn't do enough of, and I'm very mindful of now as I look at the situation we're in, is we didn't invest enough in creating a really prestigious and high quality apprenticeship route, which is basically what the Germans have had for well nigh 150 years. And that, I think, needs to be the top priority. And those sorts of jobs, craft jobs, are absolutely prime candidates for apprenticeships because they involve a lot of skill and a lot of learning. I mean, you have to do, but learning with your hands as well as book learning. And that needs to be treated, as German apprenticeships do, as a kind of course of study and learning, including practical learning, every bit as intense as a university degree. And we just haven't done that properly in this country, and we need to do it. And I completely agree, we didn't do enough, and it's a huge ongoing social imperative. I think if we're going to have a more equal and less class-ridden society, then those who at the age of 16, 17, 18 want to go into those practical careers, they need to have as much investment and as big a set of opportunities and as good institutions to attend in terms of colleges and so on as people who go to uni.
Actually, there's a slightly political question here from John Crode. Thanks, John. John says, since in Wales, you've got a Labour government there, but they're at the bottom of the table in terms of education and other aspects. I mean, what's your response to that? I suppose he's saying that Labour hasn't done a good job in Wales. I'm not so sure that that's right, but your view?
To be absolutely honest, I'm not very familiar with what has been going on in Wales in recent years. I haven't been paying close attention, so I don't know how correct that is. However, it is to state the obvious. Wales suffered, large parts of Wales, rural North Wales and the valleys, have suffered really badly and much worse on average than most of England from both rural deprivation on the one hand and deindustrialisation on the other. And so the challenges in Wales have been exceptionally tough. Now, I don't know whether the Labour devolved administration in Cardiff has been doing enough, whether it could be doing more. I can't answer that, but it certainly is the case that that they, if you look at the education challenges across Britain as a whole, Wales has got a much higher concentration of really difficult issues and social problems to deal with, I think, than equivalent parts of England.
That's a good answer. So a question from me now. I mean, you mentioned that private schools have had money pouring into them. I mean, their fees are going up and up. You have to be very rich now to send your kids to private schools. So we do still have this kind of educational apartheid in the UK, and so many university places go to private schools. So this probably will upset the audience, as I bet quite a lot of the people listening have gone to a private school. A lot of kind of top doctors have. Yeah, would you abolish the private school system? Where our prime minister, I want to come on to our prime minister in a minute. That's particularly in the current light of current events. But would you abolish private schools?
No, I wouldn't. I don't believe in. Indeed, I think it's against basic civil liberties to ban parents from being able to choose the education they think is appropriate, provided it's a quality education. It's not having deleterious effects on them or indoctrinating them in inappropriate ways or things like that. Provided the quality of the education reaches an acceptable level, I think people should be able to choose, including home education. It was a big issue when I was education minister, is whether we should be seeking to regulate home education more. And it's a difficult area, but my view is that people should have the right to home educate their children, and that's part of being in a free society. What I obviously do want to do is to see far more people not feel they need to choose private education, and certainly not feel they need to choose it because the state schools are underfunded. And that comes back to the first point I made about what the Labour government did. I think we should be putting significant additional investment into state education so that it can raise the standards and people don't feel the need to go private in that way. There is, though, also an issue about the charitable status of private schools, because whilst, as I say, I'm not in favour of abolishing private education, indeed I would at the end the right of people to educate their children as they see fit, I'm not sure that the state should be implicitly subsidising private schools by giving them substantial reliefs for assets which are deemed to be charitable, though almost no reasonable person today would actually think that Eton, Westminster, Winchester, and so on are in fact charities. And I think that is an issue, but I'm not in favour of the politics of vengeance. So I don't say that because I want to hound the private schools. I say it more as a matter of straightforward equity. It is also true, though, of course, that parents who choose to send their children to private schools are, in a sense, saving the state, so it's not a completely straightforward issue. My sort of concluding remark on it is that I certainly wouldn't want to have some kind of vendetta against private schools or anything like that. And I don't see the private schools as the big issue that the state should be paying attention to. The state should be paying attention, and really serious attention, to improving the quality of the state schools, including being prepared to put significant additional public investment in them. And that would always be my priority in government. I would hope that one of the byproducts of that would be that fewer people need to send their children to private schools, which I think would also be socially advantageous, because we'd get a less divided society as a result. But I certainly wouldn't do it by trying to hound, let alone abolish the private schools.
I think that will be a relief to quite a few of our listeners, I bet. Anyway, Nick Bailey's asked quite a nice question here. I'd like to ask Andrew if he believes that further education should be given more importance and funding, not just to support the ambitions of young people, but for adults as well. It's been sadly neglected, especially for adults. So what are your thoughts about?
I completely agree. I completely agree. If we did what I was saying earlier about apprenticeships, that of course would be a big boost and a big additional role for further education, because the apprenticeship training and courses, including high level, up to degree standard, would be provided in at least in the early stages by FE colleges. But I think that point about people having the right to retrain, to develop their skills more widely, and all of that is really important. And I think FE institutions should be much more prized and cultivated as institutions in local communities. And part of the reason for that is adult education. So I completely agree with that.
Great. Well, let's move on from education, because we're more than halfway through. Let's move on to transport, and there's some recent developments in that. But you were behind HS2, the planning of that, weren't you? I mean, you're one of the architects of HS2. So the decision not to take it through to Leeds probably upsets you, as well as all the people in Yorkshire.
Yes, it does. Well, I sort of largely designed the HS2 scheme when I was Transport Secretary in the last 18 months of the Labour government. To my mind, it was a no-brainer. One of my principles of public policy is that R&D in most public policy is rob and duplicate. What you do is you find things that work really well and you copy them. You have to make allowances for particular circumstances, but allowing for that, they're often less than people think, by the way, but allowing for that, you should copy them. And I'd spent, when I was an advisor to Tony Blair, long before I became Transport Secretary, I tried hard to push high-speed rail as a big investment that the country should be making, not because I think I had the higher wisdom on this, but because I just noticed that almost every other European and Asian country had, for the previous 50 years, been building high-speed rail lines between their major cities. And this was proving economically transformational. Japan opened the first high-speed line, the bullet train, as we came to call it, between its three major cities, Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, in 1964 for the opening of the Tokyo Olympics. And though people sort of quite quaintly, for the next 20 years in Europe at large, thought this was a kind of strange Italian technological thing which couldn't be transplanted, in the 70s, the Italians, then in the 80s, the French, and then in the 90s, the Germans all started copying it. And they didn't look back either. And their high-speed lines proved a great success. And though they're quite difficult to build, because, of course, high-speed lines have to be straight, and therefore the planning issues are quite complex and so on. Once they were opened, they became hugely economically and socially important. And I thought we'd missed a trick by, apart from the one line going to the Channel Tunnel, we hadn't built any high-speed lines. In particular, we didn't have high-speed lines between our three major cities, which are London, Birmingham, and Manchester, and then our fourth, Leeds. So that's where the idea of HS2 came from. And what I did was to provide a plan for it and real momentum for it, which meant that it wasn't unstoppable. It developed huge momentum by the time that Labour government ended, and it was continued then by the Cameron government. I think it's a huge mistake to lop off the last third of the scheme. It's true that of the four cities that HS2 serves, Leeds is the smaller, but Leeds is strategically hugely important to levelling up, not just because it is a big northern city and a conurbation, at the heart of the West Yorkshire conurbation, but because if HS2 doesn't go to Leeds and only does London, Birmingham, Manchester, there is no high-speed line at all in the eastern part of the country. And in terms of the economic geography of the country over the next 50 years, 100 years, that's going to lead to a massive drain of of people, businesses and all of that to the western part of the country and to the south. And given that we actually don't want to depopulate Yorkshire and have it as a second class part of the country, strategically, that is a big mistake. And that's why I strongly oppose and did my very best to try and persuade Boris Johnson to keep the eastern leg of HS2. I think it will be built because the controversy has been so great about cancelling it. And I think a future government, one of the things it will do to, as it were, make good this great insult and economic difficulty that's being caused to Yorkshire and the North East, I think that they'll reverse that. So it'll just get built in on a slightly slower timescale.
Yeah, there have been an awful lot of U-turns, so there could be one of this. And it's mainly cost is the reason that they've done that, is it? And also short-term political gain, because it won't be built for 8-10 years, and so there's no immediate benefit.
So what they've done is a classic Treasury manoeuvre.
Yeah.
In return for not doing the big scheme, which actually is the one that is most productive, they're instead funding a number of smaller schemes which can be brought to fruition sooner. Now, some of those schemes, like for example, the tram scheme in Leeds, I strongly support. I don't think they're either or. You don't always have to choose between good things in life. And if you're the point about the high-speed line is, I think it's utterly inconceivable that in 50 years' time we won't have high-speed lines linking our major cities. So if we're going to do it anyway, why not just get on with it? There isn't a net saving. It's not a choice of, not doing some activity which you can then not need to do at all. By cancelling a third of HS2 now, we're not making any saving as a country over the medium term. We'd end up probably having to spend more and do it more slowly than what we would have done anyway. So to coin a phrase, when traversing a chasm, it's advisable to do so in one leap.
Was Crossrail one of your...
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
And that one is going ahead, and that will open. I mean, it had big construction difficulties, but it will open next year now. That's very good news for London.
We're excited about that because the RSM is based in very close to Bond Street, about 2 minutes walk from Bond Street. So it's going to make a huge difference.
Huge transformational difference. Yeah.
No, we are excited about that. So let's move on to Brexit now, which is still a massively controversial issue. It's changed, it's been the dominant issue in our lives the last, 6 years, maybe even more than that. I mean, where did that come from? Well, let's go back in time. I mean, do you think, where were the big mistakes made for even getting this thing started? And do you think now there's any chance we might rejoin the European Union? There's a question from Dr. Fumi asking that question. So, I mean, you can tell that I'm a Remainer, not a Brexiteer, and some of our audience may be completely different, but we'd like to hear your views. We know you're a European.
Well, I'm chairman of the European Movement, which is the body which was established by Winston Churchill in the 1940s to bring Britain closer to Europe and for us not to withdraw from Europe, as we foolishly did after the First World War, which was one of the big causes of the Second World War. And the European Movement's strategy is to campaign relentlessly to take Britain step by step. It can't be done in one go, step by step towards rejoin. So I certainly think it's possible. And those who are in this meeting who are passionate about Europe, as passionate as you and I are, Roger, I hope they might join the European movement, because what I want to do is turn it into a mass membership organisation with 100,000 members, so it becomes an absolutely huge political force. Because remember, a good part of the reason why we Brexit is because Nigel Farage had this UKIP party and then his Brexit party. He was very focused and organised on a one-issue campaign, which was taking us out of Europe. And unfortunately, that succeeded. We now need, as it were, a one-issue campaign to take us back in again. And that's what the European movement's doing. But we can only do it if we have a really committed and large membership. And it's only £3 a month. Obviously, anyone who wants to give us more, that's great. But you can then play your part, making the sum more than the parts, to bring this European cause to the heart of British society again and start getting the momentum that we need to going back. And I really do strongly urge anyone who's in this meeting who's keen on Europe to do that, to become a member of the European movement. It's www.europeanmovement and join. I do think it's possible. I think it will be done in stages. I think the obvious first stage is to go back into the customs union and the single market, which is the big economic hit that we're taking by leaving the economic institutions of the European Union. And once we've done that, which I hope a future non-conservative government will do, because they won't be so ideological about Europe. And even though that doesn't take us back into the European Union as such, it takes us into a situation a bit like Switzerland and Norway, of being in the antechamber, but getting a lot of the benefits in terms of freedom of movement, people being able to forge careers and practice their trade, including medics and all of that, much more freely across Europe, and vice versa. And I think if we go back into the single market and the customs union, it's only a matter of time before we rejoin the European Union, particularly given the fact that as demographics change and young people who are overwhelmingly pro-European become voters and so on, then I think that in 5 or 10 years' time, the balance of the electorate will be strongly pro-European. And though whilst we've got a Brexit government in office that wouldn't listen to that anyway, because they're too ideological, it's not going to move. I think we could see things moving really quite quickly, maybe even very suddenly, once the government changes, with these demographic pressures and with the obvious economic imperative to get back into the European market. Yeah. So I'm still basically an optimist. I think it was a desperate tragedy, Brexit. It's doing a lot of damage to us socially and economically, but it's not a lost cause by any means. I think our destiny is to be in Europe. Our economic self-interest is to be. The young don't need persuading. They know that's the case. So what we're really waiting for is a political leader who will run with this. And we haven't got one at the moment because they're all too battle-scarred from Brexit. On the contrary, we've got a Brexit government led by Boris Johnson. And unfortunately, in Keir Starmer, we've got a Labour leader who's trying to pretend that Europe doesn't exist. He's suffering from a kind of PTSD after Brexit. But that will change. That will change quite quickly. It's only a matter of time. Maybe the next Labour leader after this, who realises that there's a massive social issue and economic issue about Europe, and it's ripe for the picking, the European issue. In defence of Keir Starmer, you can't talk about one issue the whole time. And given that we had said, as you said, Roger, we'd spent the best part of 5 years talking about nothing but Europe, I can see that he thought, and maybe he was correct, that you weren't going to be able to get the debate back on the rejoin agenda immediately. We had to go through some intervening stage where people saw what happened with this Brexit. And that is what's going on at the moment. And as they see it, I don't think they like it much. You know, the empty supermarket shelves, the half-mile queues for petrol, the crisis in Northern Ireland, all these professionals, including artists and musicians and all that, who can't ply their trade across Europe, and. So it's proving a pretty big disaster, Brexit. And I think probably, just letting it run for a while and people understanding the scale of the disaster may be the kind of trauma we had to go through in order to get back on a rejoin trajectory.
Yeah, I think COVID has sort of masked the impact of Brexit, hasn't it? There's a question about from Dr. Boura, I think. There's been on flash news today, 31 people have died in a small boat near the French coast. What would be your suggestions for a way forward in terms of dealing with the migrant crisis? Or is it really a crisis?
Yeah, we have to deal with it on a European basis, don't we? Yeah. I mean, part of the reason this is happening is because we don't have proper arrangements with the French on how we process asylum seekers, refugees, and so on, and what our common approach is. And part of the reason we don't have that is because we spend all our time insulting the French. You know, Priti Patel wants to insult the French. She can insult the French, but she can't then complain that we don't have a joint approach to how we're going to deal with refugees and asylum seekers in transit, and what we're going to do with them when they are on these precarious boats and all of that. There is, of course, underlying this, a massive economic issue. Of course there is. Europe is a land of plenty, and people are desperately fleeing persecution and they're economic migrants who want to get here. So we're not going to be able to, as it were, extinguish the cause of this. This is, as it were, a facet of modern European life, but we could handle it much, much better if we had a close and cooperative relationship with our European partners. And the fact that we haven't got one of those, and indeed, on the contrary, we seem to be making it an object of national policy to insult the French, I think is a really bad idea, a really bad one.
Let's talk a little bit. I'm not allowed to be political because the RSM is an apolitical institution. So in a way, that's quite good, really. But let's talk about our current Prime Minister, because you've written a book about leadership and you've written well, a chapter in that book and in Prospect magazine, which both your articles, including the recent one in Prospect magazine, are really good. I recommend them to our listeners. But Boris, I mean, things seem to be unraveling. Is that because Boris is Boris? And what's your predictions for the immediate future with our Prime Minister?
They are unraveling and they're not. I mean, he's clearly, his government is chaotic. And it's got some fundamentally stupid policies, Brexit being the biggest one. And indeed, a lot of the chaos results from that because, he can't handle the after effects of this big Brexit shock. One disastrous policy is multiplying into other disastrous policies. However, he's still at even Stevens in the polls or in some ahead. He does have a certain charisma and he absolutely knows how to develop a celebrity political personality. And that, as I argue in my Prospect article and at somewhat greater length in the book, which I've just published, which you can get on Amazon, it's the leader stupid, making the argument that the thing that really matters in politics is leadership. And I say this not as a supporter of his, because of course I strongly oppose his Brexit project, and I think his government is chaotic. But he does have a leadership thing. He has an ability through his charismatic hold and projection to win elections, and he has of course been helped in that by the fact that my party, the Labour Party, has been very bad at producing leaders. It hasn't produced a decent leader who's better than the equivalent Conservative leader since Tony Blair. And part of the argument of my book is the best leader in a technical sense, not necessarily the one you agree with, but the one who's best in terms of their leadership equipment, is almost invariably the one who wins an election. And you didn't need hindsight, I predicted it at the time, to know that a general election where the two leading candidates were Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, that only had one outcome, and it was Boris Johnson. And that is part of the problem we're in at the moment, is even though his policies are defective, sometimes disastrous, indeed, a lot of the people who vote for Boris think his policies are defective and disastrous, but they still do it, partly because they're attracted to his leadership qualities. They like the charisma, the personality, and all that, but also partly because they look at what's on the other side and they think it's worse. I know a lot of people who were strongly pro-Remain who voted Conservative in the 2019 election because they simply weren't prepared to put Jeremy Corbyn in 10 Downing Street. They thought on the balance of advantages, that was still worse. And, I sort of understand that point of view. And that is a big problem. Until Labour gets a leader who is clearly better as a leader than Boris Johnson, we're going to be prey to him winning, despite the fact a large proportion of his own voters don't actually agree with a lot of what he's doing and will freely say that they think he's a chaotic and disastrous Prime Minister.
Well, let's talk about Keir Starmer then, because I was watching him on Prime Minister's Question Time today, and I thought he came across really quite well and so different from Boris Johnson. But is it his lack of charisma that you think is the problem with him?
He clearly doesn't have the have I got news for you, chummy, cracking one-liner, Bertie Wooster type charisma that Boris has got. But you don't necessarily need that charisma to succeed in politics. Charisma comes in many forms in life, not just in politics. There's a charisma that comes from quiet confidence. I don't necessarily want a massively extrovert surgeon. I do want somebody who persuades me, which you exude, Roger, that they are highly professional and that I'm not likely to die on the operating theatre. That really matters to me. So charisma comes in many forms. I think, choosing my words a bit carefully, because I like him and I support him, that Keir's problem is that whilst he obviously doesn't have the extrovert charisma, I'm not sure he has enough of the, as it were, the introvert charisma either. I think he's made one or two big strategic mistakes, of which the biggest by far was not to talk about Europe. Because if his charisma is going to be that he's the guy who gets it right, as opposed to Boris who gets it wrong, and that is a form of charisma, that is the Angela Merkel charisma. You don't roll around in the aisles laughing at Angela Merkel jokes, but you do want her running the country because she's highly competent. Yeah. The problem with Keir, which I hope he can work on, but it is a big problem at the moment, is a lot of the things that need doing, if you're going to be the answer to Boris Johnson, he isn't doing. A large part of the reason why I think the country may in due course want to replace Boris is because of the disaster of Brexit. But very, very foolishly, Keir has said that he supports the Brexit. He even supports the trade and cooperation agreement that Boris negotiated because he doesn't want to reopen Brexit as an issue. And he doesn't because he thinks that he'd be on a hiding to nothing if he did so. Now, I'm a seasoned politician. I worked for one of the, the only other really charismatic political leader in our lifetime in Britain, which was Tony Blair. And I think Keir is comprehensively wrong on that, on big issues which matter to the country. You can't duck. You have to persuade the country. The answer to Boris being a disaster on Brexit isn't to go along with Brexit, hoping that you can get in on other issues. The answer is actually to make the convincing and compelling argument as to why we should go back into the customs union and the single market so that we don't sacrifice our economy. So I think the problem at the moment is that Keir is neither the charismatic leader who can compete with Boris on the telegenic and all of that stakes, but nor is he the highly competent antidote, as it were, to Boris as in terms of his failed policy. And I think that therefore, unless he can get his act together in a really serious way, I'm afraid I think I can see where the next election is going.
I've got a question, last question, because we're running out of time, from John Rye. This quite interesting question. How do you see the use of the English language in the world changing over the next few years? I mean, I guess that's a question about the developments in the Far East and China and so on. Yeah,
it's a really interesting question. Well, it's becoming the lingua franca, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's great for Britain. It's a huge USP for us. Including British education. Part of the reason why British education is such a massive export, people want to come and study here, vast numbers of Chinese students now, universities, and so on, is because of the English language. So I think we should milk it for what it's worth. I think it's a great source of national advantage. And also, of course, it means that we can export our values too, because they're speaking our language. With a bit of luck, some of our culture will rub off. And I think if you're looking at the Far East, that could be quite an important thing for the future of the world. I mean, we're faced with a sort of megalomaniac dictator in President Xi in China at the moment. So I hope all his up-and-coming youngsters are learning English. With a bit of luck over time, it's clearly not going to happen in the immediate future, they might want a political system that's a bit more like ours, as well as following their careers in the English language. So I think we should be completely with it. We should really market our universities and our education system aggressively in these countries, and hopefully then we'll not only be doing our country some good, we might be doing civilization some good too. That's my view on that one.
That's good. I mean, that's the sort of global Britain we should be talking about, rather than the. I think that's right. That's a great kind of final reply. Don't go away, Andrew, because I just got to make a few announcements. Things are really happening at the RSM. We're open again, so do come along. In Conversation Live next week, we've got Dame Jane Dacre, one of the leading women in medicine. The week after that, we've got Andy Burnham from the Northern Powerhouse talking to Simon Wesley on the 8th of December. In the building, we've got Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, doing the Salisbury lecture on the 29th of November. Come along to that. We've got Stephen O'Reilly, one of the world's experts on diabetes and metabolic syndrome, giving the Howard lecture on the 2nd of December. And to add on top of all of that, we've got Jed Mercurio talking to Victoria MacDonald about his amazing Line of Duty series on the 3rd of December. So things are really happening. Of course, we still need your support. So if you are feeling generous, then please do donate to keep the RSM going. And Andrew, thanks for your plug for the European movement. I think I will join up to that, actually. So you've recruited one extra member today. It's
also cross-party, because our aim is to persuade all of the political, because we're only going to get back into Europe again if we can develop a consensus across the parties, I think. So our aim is to influence them all. But can I also just say, I think what you do is fantastic. I think it's a great thing for the Royal Society to do this sort of outreach work and setting what you do, which is so socially indispensable to us in a wider context. So congratulations to you, Roger, to your team who've been enormously efficient in setting this up, and to the 205 people I see are still on this call. I think we're up to 240 who are taking a bit of time out to look at the wider picture facing the country. I think it's a fantastic thing that the Society does. And thanks very much for inviting me to be with you this evening.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and have a good evening. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Goodbye.